The house had never felt so large. I remember standing at the kitchen window that morning, watching the sun come up over the backyard. The same backyard where I'd pushed my son on a tire swing 30 years ago, where I'd taught my daughter to ride a bike, where my wife and I had hosted every 4th of July cookout until the year she got sick and the traditions quietly died with her. The oak tree we'd planted together the year we moved in was enormous now, its branches reaching out over the fence like it was trying to hold on to something. I understood the feeling. I was 63 years old, recently retired from 31 years in commercial real estate, and I was standing in my kitchen at 6:15 in the morning making coffee for one. That was my life. That was fine. I had made peace with quiet. What I had not made peace with, what I don't think any parent fully makes peace with, is the particular silence that follows. Realizing your children have moved on, not just from your home, but from you. My son was 34. He'd married 4 years earlier, a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law, and together they lived about 40 minutes away in a house I'd helped them purchase. Not gifted. I want to be clear about that distinction, because it matters later. I had co-signed the mortgage, contributed $70,000 toward the down payment, and covered the renovation costs when they decided the kitchen wasn't to their taste 6 months after moving in. The kitchen renovation alone ran $42,000. I paid it because my son asked, and because I told myself, that's what fathers do. That's the story I told myself for a long time. The truth is more complicated, and I've had enough time since everything happened to sit with the truth honestly. I gave because giving made me feel needed. I gave because, after my wife passed, my children were the only people left who required something from me. And being required felt close enough to being loved that I stopped examining the difference too carefully. I had built a successful career, accumulated more than most people dream of, and I had no one to share it with except my kids. So I shared, generously, constantly, without conditions. That was my mistake. Not the generosity itself. I still believe generosity is a virtue, but the absence of conditions, the absence of the word no, the absence of any moment where I sat my son down and said, "You are a grown man, and grown men build their own lives." Instead, I built it for him. The monthly transfer was $4,000. It had started smaller, 3 years before his wedding, when he was between jobs and needed help with rent. Just temporary, we both said. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one draws a line. By the time he got married, the $4,000 had simply become part of the landscape of his life, as expected, as the changing of seasons, as unremarkable as a utility bill. He never thanked me for it anymore. You don't thank the electric company every month. You just expect the lights to come on. His wife drove a car I leased. I'm not sure she knew that, actually. My son handled the financial arrangements in their household, and I suspect he presented things to her in whatever light was most flattering to himself. That's his business. But the car I was making payments on was a silver SUV, and I saw her drive it every time they came to visit, which, by the fall of last year, had become less and less frequent. Thanksgiving. They had plans with her family. I understood. Christmas, they came by for exactly 2 hours on Christmas Eve, exchanged gifts in the entryway with their coats still on, and left before dinner. I had cooked a full meal. I ate it alone over the next 3 days. My birthday is in February 14th, which my wife always joked was either romantic or cruel depending on the year. Last February, my son texted me at 11:40 in the morning. Not called. Texted. "Happy birthday, Dad. Hope you have a good one." That was the entire message. My daughter-in-law sent a gif of a birthday cake through the same thread. I stared at that gif for longer than I'd like to admit. I didn't say anything. I thanked them and told them I was doing great. I wasn't doing great. But I want to tell you about the Thursday in March, because that's where the story really begins. That's the Thursday everything changed, not because of what I did, but because of what my son said. Or rather, what he wrote. What he put in writing and sent to me at 9:17 in the morning while I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, watching the oak tree in the backyard. My phone buzzed. I picked it up expecting nothing important, a news alert, a prescription reminder, something ordinary. Instead, I saw my son's name. and below it the beginning of a message long enough that it had been truncated in the preview. I set my coffee down and opened it. I'm going to tell you what it said, as close to word for word as I can remember, because I've read it enough times that it's embedded somewhere permanent in my memory. He said that he and my daughter-in-law had been doing a lot of reflecting lately. He said they felt that our relationship had become complicated and stressful for them. He said they needed to prioritize their mental health and their marriage. He said, and this is the sentence I keep returning to, the one I still feel somewhere behind my sternum when I think about it, he said, "We need significant distance from you. Please don't reach out to us for the time being. We'll contact you when we're ready." I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on the table and sat very still for a while. I want to tell you I was angry. Anger would have been clean, useful, something to move through. But the first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was something smaller and older and much more embarrassing. I felt the way I had felt at 8 years old when I wasn't invited to a birthday party I didn't even know was happening until Monday morning at school. That particular flavor of shame that comes with discovering you were excluded from something and no one thought you were important, enough to even include in the rejection until it was convenient. My son was 34 years old, living in a house I'd helped buy, driving his wife around in a car I was paying for, receiving $4,000 every first of the month without fail for 3 years, and he needed distance from me. I picked the phone back up. I opened the message again. I noticed something I'd missed the first 2 times. At the bottom of the thread, underneath my son's message, was a small notification. My daughter-in-law had liked it. Not replied. Liked it, as if it were a pleasant post about a vacation or a recipe. She had pressed a small heart on the message in which my son told his father to disappear, and left it at that. I set the phone back down. I finished my coffee. I washed the mug. I put on my shoes and my jacket, and I went for a walk around the neighborhood, because that's what I do when I need to think without the walls of that house pressing in on me. I walked for almost an hour. I went past the elementary school where my son had learned to read, past the park where I used to take both my kids on Sunday afternoons when they were small enough that Sunday afternoons still felt like a gift rather than an obligation. I walked and I thought, and I let the cold air clear out whatever was sitting in my chest. And somewhere on that walk, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where I stopped on the sidewalk and made a decision. It was more like a slow, quiet, settling the way a house makes sounds at night as it adjusts to the cold, small structural confirmations. I had given my son everything I had to give, and he had taken it the way a person takes things they believe they are owed. And I had let him because I confused his need for my money with his need for me. Those are not the same thing. I know that now with a certainty I didn't have before. I also knew, by the time I got back to my house and sat down at my desk, that I needed to make a phone call. His name was Gerald, and he had been my estate attorney for 11 years. I had worked with him on my wife's estate after she passed, a process that had been painful in every possible dimension, and Gerald had been steady and careful and thorough throughout. He knew my finances better than almost anyone. He knew what I had, how it was structured, where things were held, and in whose names, and under what terms. When I called him that Thursday morning and told him I needed to come in as soon as possible, he heard something in my voice and said he had an opening at 2 o'clock. I was there at 1:50. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of office that communicates stability and discretion through its furnishings rather than stating it directly. Dark wood, good light, framed credentials arranged without vanity. Gerald was a compact man, in his late 50s, with silver hair and the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that what people say first is rarely the whole story. He poured coffee without asking and slid a legal pad across the desk, more out of habit than necessity. I told him everything, not just the message from that morning, all of it, the down payment, the renovation, the monthly transfers, the car, the Christmas Eve visit with their coats on, the birthday gift. I told him things I hadn't said out loud to anyone, including my daughter, who lived across the country and with whom I spoke on Sunday evenings, and carefully maintained the impression that everything in my life was manageable and fine. Gerald listened without interrupting. He made notes. When I finished, he looked at his legal pad for a moment and then looked at me. "What do you want to do?" he asked. That's one of the things I appreciate most about Gerald. He doesn't tell you what to think. He asks what you want, and then he helps you do it as efficiently and completely as possible. I told him what I wanted to do. He nodded slowly, reviewed his notes, and said, "This is all achievable. Some of it can be handled this week. Some of it will take a few weeks for the paperwork to process. But yes, all of it." We talked for 2 hours. The first item was the simplest. The automatic monthly transfer, $4,000, set up through my bank as a recurring payment. Gerald wasn't involved in that one. I handled it myself the following morning, sitting at my desk with my laptop. It took 6 minutes to log in, navigate to the recurring transfers section, and cancel it. 6 minutes for something that had been happening every single month for 3 years. There's something vertiginous about that, the ease of undoing what felt immovable. The second item was the car. My son's name was on the lease as the primary driver, but the account was linked to my credit and the payments came from my account. I called the leasing company that same Friday. I explained that I needed to remove the vehicle from my account effective at the end of the current billing cycle. The representative walked me through the process. It was not complicated. My daughter-in-law would receive a notice within 10 business days, informing her that the lease account had been restructured and providing information about her options going forward. Gerald had advised that I send a separate written notice to my son informing him of the change, which I did a brief, factual letter, 3 sentences, no explanation beyond what was legally necessary. The third item was the mortgage. This one was more nuanced, and Gerald had spent considerable time on it during our meeting. I was not the primary mortgage holder, that was my son's name on the loan, but I was the co-signer, and the $70,000 I had contributed toward the down payment had been documented at Gerald's original insistence as a personal loan rather than a gift. I had been reluctant to frame it that way at the time. It felt clinical, transactional, at odds with the spirit in which I'd given it. Gerald had been firm. "You never know," he'd said. In the mild and unemphatic way, he says things that turn out to be exactly right. Because we had documented it correctly, there were legal avenues available to me that would not have existed otherwise. I won't go into the specifics because this isn't a legal document, but what I will tell you is that I spent the better part of 3 days on the phone with Gerald and my financial advisor and, eventually, a second attorney who specialized in real estate law, and by the end of those 3 days, I had initiated a process that my son was going to feel. The fourth item was the will. I had last updated my will 18 months after my wife passed, in a fog of grief and good intentions. It was generous to a degree that, in hindsight, reflected not clear thinking, but a desperate attempt to be loved posthumously, to ensure that my children would think well of me even after I was gone, to be there to see it. Gerald had gently flagged some elements as potentially unwise even then, and I had brushed off his concern. Now I sat in his office again, and we went through it line by line. I won't tell you the specifics of what I changed, because that's private, and also because specifics invite arguments about whether I was fair. And fairness isn't really the point. The point is that I looked at what I had written 18 months earlier and I understood for the first time that it was written by someone trying to buy love rather than express it. I rewrote it as someone who had stopped trying. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is what separates a story worth telling from one that's just flattering. During those first few days, while I was on the phone with Gerald, while I was logging into the bank, while I was composing the letter about the car, I told myself I was acting from a place of clarity. Rational, measured, not revenge, just correction. A reallocation of resources based on updated information. That wasn't entirely true. Part of it was anger. Part of it was hurt. Part of it was the specific and humiliating pain of a parent who realizes, at 63, that he spent years auditioning for a role in his own child's life, performing the part of useful father, writing checks to prove his value, and still got cut from the cast. Some of what I did in those first 72 hours came from that pain, and I think it's important to admit that, because if I pretend I was purely rational and principled, I'm doing the same thing I always did. presenting a version of myself designed to be approved of. The truth is, I was both things at once. I was hurt, and I was also right. Both can be true. By the end of that first week, the processes were in motion. Not all of them visible yet. Some would take time to materialize, to arrive in the form of notices and statements, and the quiet disappearance of deposits that my son had long since stopped noticing. I had told no one what I was doing. I hadn't called my daughter, hadn't mentioned it to any friends, hadn't posted anything or said anything that could have circled back. I went about my days, my walks, my coffee, my evenings, reading in the chair by the window, and waited. I did not respond to my son's message. He had asked me not to reach out. I respected that request with a thoroughness he was not expecting. 11 days after I sent the letter about the car, my son called me. I was in the backyard, pulling dead growth from the garden bed along the back fence, something I do in early spring to get ready for planting season, something my wife and I used to do together. My phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. I stood there in my gardening gloves and looked at it ring. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. He called again 4 minutes later. I let that one go too. The third call came 12 minutes after the second. This time I sat down on the garden bench, pulled off one glove, and answered. Dad. His voice was different from the last time we'd spoken, which had been a brief call in January about nothing in particular. There was something compressed in it, tightly wound. Dad, I got a letter from a leasing company. I know, I said. Silence. What is that? What does that mean? It means the lease is being restructured. The letter explains your options. Dad. His voice shifted. Something trying to find its footing. Can you explain what's happening? Because I came home and my wife showed me this letter and she's pretty upset and I'm not understanding what's going on. I looked at the oak tree. A robin was doing something in the high branches, some small, urgent business of its own. You asked me not to reach out, I said. I've been respecting that. I'm still respecting it, actually. You called me. Another silence. Longer this time. We were just going through some stuff, Dad. We needed some space. That doesn't mean he stopped. I could hear him trying to recalibrate. Is this about the message? Is this retaliation? I thought carefully before I answered. I've been doing some thinking, I said, about what our relationship looks like, about what I've contributed and what that contribution was based on. I think I've been giving in ways that weren't healthy for either of us. Okay. His voice had gone careful now, cautious. The voice of someone approaching something they can sense but can't see yet. Okay, but Dad, we need that car. She doesn't have another. The letter has information about your options, I said again. Gerald can answer any legal questions. Gerald? You brought Gerald into this? I didn't say anything. Dad. Something cracked open a little in his voice. I don't understand what's happening right now. Can we just talk? Can we have a conversation? I'd like that, I said. I've wanted to have a conversation for a long time. He came over 2 days later. Without his wife, which surprised me. I had expected them to arrive together, some kind of unified front. Instead, he came alone on a Sunday afternoon, and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and had the most honest conversation we had managed in years. He was defensive at first. He said things designed to reframe the situation in ways more comfortable to him, that they'd been under stress, that the message was impulsive, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, I want to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it, not just wait for me to finish. He nodded. I have not been a good father to you, I said. He looked startled. That wasn't what he'd been bracing for. I've been a generous father, I continued. I've been a financially available father. I've given you things, and paid for things, and stepped in financially in ways that felt like love to me, and I think felt like obligation to you, or worse, like you're right. And that is on me. I set that up. I let it become that. I was so afraid of losing you after your mother died that I made myself useful instead of present, and I let the money become a stand-in for the actual relationship I should have been building with you. My son was quiet. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty, I said. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think we've been operating inside that dynamic for so long that neither of us knows what it looks like without it. I don't want to keep doing that." He stared at his coffee for a long time. And then, slowly, the defensiveness started to go out of him. I could see it, physically, in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw. What replaced it was something younger and less armored. He said, very quietly, "I didn't realize how much of what I had was from you." "I know you didn't," I said. "I made sure you didn't. I handled it in ways designed to be invisible because I thought that was gracious." It wasn't gracious. It was me hiding the scoreboard so I could keep playing a game you didn't know we were in. He looked up at me. "So what does this mean? Are you done with me? Is that what this is?" I shook my head. "I'm not done with you, but I'm done with the arrangement we've had. The money, the transfers, the covering of things, that's over. Not as punishment, as a reset, because if we're going to have a real relationship, it can't be built on transactions. You're 34 years old, and you're capable, and I need to treat you like you are, and you need to discover that you are." He didn't say much after that. He sat with it. He asked a few practical questions about the car, about the mortgage situation, about timing. I answered what I could and referred him to Gerald for the rest. When he left, 2 hours after he'd arrived, he hugged me in the doorway. It was the longest he'd held on in years. I don't know if it was grief or relief or something he couldn't name yet. Maybe all three. I stood in the doorway after his car pulled away and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy, exactly. Not victorious. Something quieter than that and more durable. The feeling of having told the truth to someone who needed to hear it and having been heard. The feeling of a man who has decided, finally and at 63 years old, to stop paying for love and to either earn it or live without it, and to be genuinely all right with either outcome. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because it didn't resolve cleanly, and I think clean resolutions are a lie that stories tell to make themselves feel complete. My daughter-in-law did not come to that first conversation. She called me herself, about a week later, a call I almost didn't pick up. When I did, she was polite in the way people are polite when they're afraid, carefully, without warmth, as if warmth might be taken as a concession. She asked if there was any possibility of discussing the car situation. I told her I'd already provided all the relevant information through Gerald and the leasing company. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I've thought about since. "I didn't realize you were paying for so much." He told me things where he said it differently. I believed her. I still believe her, actually. My son had not been fully honest with his wife about the financial arrangements, which created its own set of problems for them that were entirely separate from whatever was happening with me. That wasn't my fault, but I'll admit it wasn't my problem to solve either, and I was careful not to make it one. She and I did not talk again for several weeks. My son and I spoke twice more on the phone during that time, short calls, careful, both of us feeling out the new geography of this relationship that was being slowly unmade and remade at the same time. He was stressed. His wife was stressed. They were figuring out things they should have had to figure out years ago, and that process was hard and uncomfortable, and sometimes I could hear the edge of resentment in his voice. When we talked, the urge to blame me for the difficulty. I didn't fight it. Resentment is part of the process sometimes. I'd rather he resent me for telling the truth than thank me for telling him what he wanted to hear. In April, about 6 weeks after the initial message, my son called on a Wednesday evening, unscheduled, not the brief functional calls we'd been having. He said he'd been thinking. He said he'd talked to someone, a counselor he'd started seeing, which surprised me and made me more hopeful than I let on in the moment. He said he understood now how much he'd been taking for granted. He said he was sorry. I told him I appreciated that. I told him I was sorry too for the years of unspoken scorekeeping, for letting generosity substitute for presence, for not having this conversation 10 years earlier when it might have been easier for both of us. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. It was the longest phone call we'd had since before his mother died. I don't know where we go from here. I want to be honest about that. We are not fixed. We are not back to some golden version of what things used to be, because what things used to be was never quite what I was pretending it was. What we are is two people who have started to be honest with each other, maybe for the first time, about who we are and what we want and what we're actually capable of giving. That is something that is, in fact, quite a lot. What I know is this. I am 63 years old, and I am living in the house where I raised my children. And the oak tree in the backyard is enormous. And some mornings I still make too much coffee out of habit before I remember I'm alone. And I am all right. Not because everything worked out, but because I finally stopped trying to purchase outcomes and started simply being a man who tells the truth and does what he says and offers love without attaching invisible invoices to it. My son called last Sunday, not to ask for anything, just to talk. He told me about something funny that happened at work, and I told him about the garden, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. And when we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my cold coffee and felt, for a moment, exactly like a father. That was enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. Before I go, I want to ask you something, because I think about this question, and I don't think there's a single right answer. If your child pushed you away, the way mine did, if they told you to disappear and then came back when the money was gone, would you take them back? Would you extend the grace? Or would you hold the line, protect yourself, let them live with the consequences permanently? I'm genuinely asking. I think about it more than I let on. Let me know in the comments what you would do. And if this story hit close to home, you know what to do, stick around. There's more where this came from.